David, the last time we spoke, this was, I think, a few weeks to the election. And we spoke extensively about the election in itself, the INEC, the role the INEC will play, and what could potentially happen. I followed what you've been saying on Twitter during the elections, when ballot boxes were being snatched, people were not being given the opportunity to vote, and so on and so forth. Should Nigerians be concerned? Because you heard what some Nigerians were saying out there with the election petition.
Very usefulness, very sanctity of the Nigerian judiciary is on trial here because, as I've said elsewhere before, this isn't the first time that a Nigerian election will be contested. This isn't the first time a Nigerian election will be rigged, certainly. But what this is the first time that the electoral irregularities have been done in such a slapdash, brazen manner, in a way that almost insults everyone's intelligence, kind of. So everyone is kind of waiting to see what the judiciary is going to do, because where you have a situation where the information which is contained on INEC's own IREV server doesn't match the results that INEC announced, such as, for example, the results in Rivers State, where INEC's own data now states very clearly that Peter Obi won the presidential election in Rivers State, but the APC was announced by INEC as the winner of the presidential election in Rivers State. So and there are several other states like that, Nasarawa, Plateau, several such instances. So what is the judiciary going to do? We're waiting to see. And I think the other reason why this is sort of a historic presidential petition is that I think this is the first time that this many Nigerians have been tuned into this process. I mean, as the report rightly said, every election since '99 has gone to a tribunal. It's no strange thing for a Nigerian election to be contested, but there was actually a campaign which I was part of, and I'm still part of, to actually live stream the
I was going to
events of
come
the
to that
tribunal.
because Atiku is also calling for the tribunal to be streamed live.
Yes. So the idea essentially is that the Nigerian judiciary needs to be aware that it is under the spotlight. That one thing that the Nigerian judiciary is known or infamous for is delivering this thing called justice by technicality.
Okay.
Where, so I stole your phone.
Yeah.
You reported me for stealing your phone. I get arrested, and at trial, instead of me getting tried for the substantive issue of stealing your phone, maybe in the police statement you made, you stated that your phone is this brand, and your phone is actually this brand, but it's a different color or a different sub model of this brand. So because of that technicality, the case gets chopped out, and I get off on a technicality. That's what Nigerian judges are sort of infamous for. So what this campaign to live stream this tribunal is an attempt to do is an attempt to put pressure on the justices for them to know that, look, the whole world is watching you. So these things these little like judicial mischiefs, if you like, which you are known for, if you do it this time, everyone is going to know.
No, not to preempt what the outcome will be in this proceedings, but are you alluding to the fact that the court or the Supreme Court cannot be trusted, or Nigerians do not trust the judiciary? The judiciary.
I think there's certainly precedent to justify Nigerians if they decide that they do not trust the judiciary. The Imo State governorship election, which I believe was 3 years ago, the candidate who finished fourth was declared the winner by the Supreme Court. The candidate who finished fourth, not second, not third, fourth, right? So I think and by the way, that ruling was so unconscionable that some of the justices who actually delivered that ruling were actually given visa bans by the U.S. State Department. That's how, bad that ruling was. So I think there's definitely reason for Nigerians to be distrustful. I think there's even more reason in this case, given that if this hearing drags on until May 29th, when the president is supposed to be sworn in normally, and Bola Ahmed Tinubu is actually sworn in as president, then it creates a whole.
And again, I was going to come to that because there's been the same instance, or should I say instances in Ghana. If I recall, I think the 2012 elections ended up in the Supreme Court.
Yes.
The 2020 elections as well ended up in the Supreme Court. But I think it was actually dealt with much more swifter
Yes,
than the previous one, 2012.
and in a much
And
more transparent
yeah,
manner as
more
well.
transparent manner. And that has always been the argument. I mean, you cannot have a president-elect sworn in and then wait for outcome of the Supreme Court.
Exactly, because then you have judges essentially trying to put a sitting president on trial. So it's been noted, for example, that one of the prayers in the petition is that the person who supposedly is the president-elect committed perjury on his electoral declaration, right? So if and obviously under Nigerian law, perjury is a criminal offense, but also under Nigerian law, a president has immunity to criminal prosecution. So, by getting sworn in, if that case has not been heard, does that then mean that going by the fact of having immunity, the case then gets thrown off by technicality, since technically the president cannot be tried for perjury even if he is guilty of
Yeah.
it? These are the issues.
But then also, this is not necessarily about the president-elect as such, Tinubu. It's about INEC. Because essentially they're the ones that declare the results.
Yes.
Polling stations, we've been told, the infamous saying, elections are won at the polling station.
Certainly wasn't in this case.
Certainly wasn't.
I mean, so what we were told before the election, and what people like me even amplified, what we were told by INEC was that this election was going to be more credible than any other election because there was going to be electronic transmission of results from the polling stations to the INEC IREV server, and that would be that. That's what we were told. What it actually turns out was the case was that yes, election results were supposed to be transmitted to the IREV server, but the results transmitted to the INEC to IREV server were not going to be the basis of what INEC declared. So what was going to be the basis of the declaration was what came out of the collation centers. And why that is an important bit of information is that the entire point of the campaign to ensure that electronic transmission takes place and the beavers and whatnot was that we were trying to cut out that middleman risk of the collation center.
Yeah.
Right, the infamous collation center where a candidate has won the election at the polling unit, and then overnight, when the papers are passing through the collation center, some magic happens and the numbers change. That's what we thought we were cutting out with the electronic transmission. It turns out we didn't cut it out at all. And INEC basically lied to us about what the electoral process was. So now these are issues which are coming out in court, and it's like, okay, so basically what we thought the 2022 Electoral Amendment Act was, it actually wasn't. So where does that leave us?
I mean, there's a lot of responsibilities on the judiciary.
Yes.
Whichever way it goes. Again, not to preempt, but just using other cases where some have argued that, listen, Nigeria is, the situation is very delicate. And in as much as it is the legal route that must prevail, common sense must also be applied, and caution must also be applied.
Exactly.
And in as much as people want justice, and we all want justice, one argument has been, should Tinubu get sworn in, how on earth can the Supreme Court come up with, and again, I say this not to preempt, how can there be, if there was a case where, okay, there was some more practice and all of a sudden the president elected, sworn in, has to be pushed to the side? Of course, he's got his followers as well. And then what we don't want to see is people taken to the streets.
So that's the issue, which is why it is my firm belief, and it's the belief of everyone who has...
So I wanted to ask, should the Supreme Court given a time frame before the swearing in of Tinubu?
Ideally, that's what should happen. And I believe that's what happened in the case of Ghana. That's what happened in the case of Kenya more recently as well. Before there's a swearing in, these petition processes need to be concluded first. And the simple reason is, if, as you said, it does happen that the Supreme Court or the tribunal or whatever reaches a judgment which basically removes the sitting president, what then happens? Because you then have a situation where you essentially need to have an interim government. What would that entail? The last time Nigeria had an interim government, which was 1993, it led to a military coup. We certainly don't want that to happen again. We've had 24 unbroken years of electoral democracy. We want that to continue if possible. So the Supreme Court needs, I don't think the Supreme Court needs us to tell them. I think they themselves need to see that there's potentially a constitutional crisis in the offing, and they need to stave it off by ensuring that between now and the 29th of May, they reach a definite conclusion on this matter, one way or the other, so that at least the country can move forward. Because the worst thing that can happen is creating a constitutional crisis in the future, and then instead of focusing on the real issues which we need to focus on in Nigeria, which is growth,
Yes.
and economic prosperity, we then have political conflict in Africa's largest country. We definitely don't. Nobody wants to see that.
All eyes are on Nigeria. People want to see INEC, the chairman of INEC, in the dock to give account of
Yes.
what actually transpired. Some are also arguing that their representative, the lawyer, can speak on their behalf. Supposedly, that would be the best way to go. Gather information so that the chairman of INEC can actually go in the dock and give accounts.
I mean, so I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to stay away from offering a legal opinion. But what I do think is that it's a reasonable expectation, especially being that INEC is itself a respondent in all of these petitions. It's a reasonable expectation that the INEC chairman, who was the one who made the results announcement, is held to account for what exactly transpired during the election. As I mentioned earlier, the picture of what the electoral process should look like, which he gave to us, turned out to not be the case. So he basically lied to an entire country about what the electoral process is. The electoral process, according to what he said, he came to Chatham House here in London and he stated very openly in front of the international media that results will be transmitted and collated via the IREV database, which was categorically not the case. So he lied to the world. So these things, like one of the problems we have, one of the many problems we have in Nigeria is that public officials basically are able to tell these huge giant fibs and are never held to account for it, right? Things which will be political scandals here, they just get away scot-free, nothing happens. So I believe in this case, the INEC chairman should be in the dock. He should be held to account for, first of all, for the budget that he has had to spend. I think this has been the most expensive election in Nigeria's entire history, and yet has been, one of the most contested and one of the most contentious. The impression we were given was that in 24, 48 hours, everything is going to be settled. It took 4 days, and it was like a 4 a.m. declaration in the dead of the night. All this skullduggery going on. Why was that? He needs to explain himself. So I don't think it's an unreasonable expectation for Mahmoud Yakubu to be in the dock. And I'll just quickly mention this as well, that INEC traditionally, historically, has been a very arrogant institution. Maybe as a result of the measure of independence that it has, INEC ignores court orders a lot, treats anything to do with public interest requests for information with a certain disdain, especially coming from the media or journalists. So I think these are some of the issues which need to be addressed now that you have been given all the money you asked for. You had a huge budget. You had everything you needed. You had all of the time. You had all of the resources you needed, and you made certain guarantees and promises. Why were these not delivered on?
I think another argument is this is the apex courts on the land in Nigeria. How important do you think, if I'm asking, because it's no hidden secret, you're a staunch supporter of Labour Party, Peter Obi. How important is it for Peter Obi to come out and say whatever decision is made by the court will be accepted?
So, personally, I mean, it's good you mentioned that I've nailed my colors firmly to the mast. First of all, I don't think the ball is in his court, because first of all, according to the official results, he supposedly came third. So I think if there's anyone who, according to the official results, stands a risk of being more dissatisfied, it should be the person who supposedly came second, whom we don't hear much about, Abubakar Atiku. So I think he is the one, more than even Peter Obi, who needs to, say such a thing. And then yes, I would agree that yes, probably Peter Obi needs to. I wouldn't necessarily say come out and make a statement of confidence in the court, but needs to at least make a position statement. If there's one issue that I've had with him, is that he sometimes sort of, he's too diplomatic about certain things. So he needs to sort of nail his colors to the mast in this instance and state exactly what the issue is. I'm not naive enough to believe that there is any sort of cast iron guarantee that justice will be served. I know in the case of Kenya, I believe this was 2015, which was a very contentious election between Raila Odinga and
Uhuru
Uhuru
Kenyatta.
Kenyatta. There was a whole drama that went on afterwards, and then Raila Odinga got some judge to swear him in as the people's
President,
president.
yes, and that's what we don't want.
Yeah, we definitely don't want that. But at the same time, I believe if Peter Obi believes that he actually legitimately won that election, then he needs to sort of stake his claim. He needs to make a definite statement. He's been sort of very vague and evasive. Oh yeah, we'll go to court to reclaim our mandate, which implies that he believes he won the election, but he doesn't really come out and state clearly that I believe this election was stolen from me, right? So I believe that at some point you need to nail your colors to the mast. You need to either tell your supporters to stand down, that regardless of what happens, let's accept this, or you need to state exactly where you stand and not sort of just hang your supporters out to dry, so to speak, which I feel has been done.
And just very briefly, I asked that question because we all know, as you rightly said, we don't want anything that could potentially disrupt the country or cause chaos. And you've already mentioned in your session there saying that there's a lack of trust with the judiciary.
Yes.
And for the public to have some sort of trust in these proceedings, then it would be ideal for the petitioners to actually come out and say, listen, we have full faith in the judiciary system. And therefore, whatever outcome must be fully respected.
Well, I mean, if I, as a total outsider, don't necessarily have faith in the judiciary, I guess I can understand why the petitioners potentially don't. And the judiciary itself, it has to be said, hasn't exactly done a lot to inspire confidence. So I recall a few weeks ago, there was a story that came out, and the person who published the story, the publication that put the story out, is very well known to me, People's Gazette. I have absolute confidence in their journalistic ethos. And there was a story that he put out that the chief judge of the Federation, Justice Kayode Ariwola, was cited in London and supposedly was here for a meeting with Tinubu, and he disguised himself as like a disabled person. He was in a wheelchair and all of that. And so either of two things should have happened after that story. There should have either been a robust rebuttal that this never happened, this was never the case, and People's Gazette should be sued for spreading like potentially dangerous misinformation, or what happened should have been clarified. Okay, he was in London or he was not in London. This was what happened. Instead, what they did was, so this story was published on a Thursday. By the following morning, Friday morning, then they did like a photo op of him in a national mosque in Abuja and made it seem like, oh yeah, he's always been in Abuja.
Wow.
And then later put out a statement saying, oh yeah, actually he wasn't. So these are the issues that help to perpetuate the narrative that something dodgy is going on.
All right.
So the judiciary itself needs to give us something.
Okay. David Hundeyin, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very
Same
much
here.
for coming on the show.